Liam Carter, Eleanor Hayes, and the town of Millbrook would never be the same after one secret was revealed, a secret that would turn a grandmother's love into deadly obsession and a quiet home into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. The town of Millbrook was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Streets were lined with neat houses, each with a carefully trimmed lawn, and neighbors waved politely when they passed each other. It was the kind of town that seemed safe, ordinary, and calm. Among the residents, Eleanor Hayes stood out, not for her wealth or beauty, but for her strict sense of order and discipline. At 68, she carried herself with a quiet authority, and most people respected her. Eleanor had lived in Millbrook all her life, raising her family according to the rules she believed in. To outsiders, she appeared as a devoted grandmother, someone who loved her grandson dearly, but beneath her composed exterior, there was a simmering rigidity in her beliefs, a sense that the world must always follow the proper path. Her grandson, Liam Carter, lived with her. He had recently turned 19 and had moved back into Eleanor's house after finishing his first year of college. Liam was reserved, introspective, and careful not to attract attention. Most people in town thought he was simply shy, a young man still trying to find his place in the world. But Liam carried a secret that he had never shared, not even with his parents. He was transgender, a truth he had only begun to understand himself. Over the past year, he had slowly started to embrace his identity, experimenting with small changes in his appearance and mannerisms, learning more about the community he had always observed from a distance. Living with Eleanor made this journey complicated. He knew her beliefs were conservative and unyielding, and he feared her reaction. Still, he longed for acceptance and a sense of safety within his own home. For now, he kept his transition hidden, quietly making adjustments to his wardrobe and experimenting with his name in private, hoping for a day when he could finally share the truth without fear. Eleanor, on the other hand, noticed subtle changes she could not fully understand. She saw the way he dressed differently at times, the way he carried himself with a newfound confidence, and the slight distance that seemed to grow between them. She did not know the cause, but unease began to creep into her mind, planting seeds of suspicion. To the neighbors and the casual visitor, their household seemed normal. Eleanor would greet friends with warmth, and Liam would smile politely when he passed people on the street. But inside the house, tension quietly simmered. Eleanor's keen eye for detail allowed her to sense that something was off, though she could not pinpoint what it was. Liam felt the weight of unspoken questions and disapproval pressing down on him, and he increasingly retreated to his room, spending hours online where he could explore his identity without fear. The walls of the house, once a place of comfort, now felt confining, filled with silent judgment that Liam could not yet name. The stage was set for a collision of worlds. Eleanor's rigid worldview was quietly strengthening, and Liam's desire for self-expression was growing bolder. Both lived under the same roof, unaware that their lives were on a trajectory that neither could control. The quiet streets of Millbrook held no hint of the storm brewing inside one unassuming house, a storm that would soon shatter the peace of their town forever. The day Liam decided to reveal his truth to Eleanor began like any other. The morning sun poured through the curtains of his room, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. He had rehearsed what he would say countless times in his head, careful to choose words that might soften the blow. He wanted her to understand, to see him as he truly was, not as the person she had always believed him to be. For months, he had carried this weight alone, hiding his identity behind polite smiles and quiet manners. Each passing day had made the secret harder to bear, and he could no longer endure the loneliness of pretending. Eleanor was in the kitchen, arranging plates for breakfast with her usual precision. She hummed softly, unaware of the storm that was about to enter her carefully ordered world. Liam took a deep breath, feeling his heart race, and stepped into the kitchen. His voice, though steady, carried a tremor he could not hide. He told her he identified as male, that he was transgender. He explained that this was not a phase or a choice, but a truth he had only recently discovered about himself. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, like an invisible knife cutting through the calm of the morning. Eleanor froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. The news did not fit into the life she had imagined for her grandson or for her family. Her mind raced, refusing to accept what she had just heard. This was not something she could reconcile with the values she had lived by for decades. She thought of the neighbors, the church, the traditions she had upheld so faithfully. The thought of her grandson living in a way she deemed wrong filled her with confusion and anger. Instead of responding with understanding, Elena felt a rising storm within her. Her thoughts spiraled, jumping from disbelief to fear, and finally to an obsessive need to control the situation. She could not imagine a world where Liam's identity was accepted. She believed she had to act, to correct what she perceived as a threat not only to him, but to the family's reputation. Liam, sensing her immediate shift in demeanor, felt a chill run down his spine. What he had hoped would bring closeness instead created distance, a wall thicker than any he had encountered before. Over the following days, Elena watched Liam closely, scrutinizing every gesture, every word, every glance. She began questioning everything he had done in the past, interpreting innocent actions as proof of a life she could not allow. Liam became more cautious, retreating further into himself, unsure of when the next outburst would come. The home that once felt safe now brimmed with tension and unspoken fear. The revelation had not only changed their relationship, it had begun to reshape their entire household. Elena's obsession with control was growing stronger, while Liam's sense of isolation deepened. Each past day increased the silent battle between them, a struggle that neither fully understood but both felt acutely. A quiet, invisible conflict had been ignited, one that would set the course for events neither of them could have anticipated, and one that would ultimately shatter the fragile peace of their small, unsuspecting town. After Liam's revelation, Elena's mind became a maze of obsession and fear. Every detail of her grandson's life seemed to demand her attention. She watched him more closely than ever, noticing the smallest changes in his appearance or behavior and interpreting them as signs of rebellion. A slight hesitation in his voice, a new shirt he wore, the way he styled his hair, all of it fed the anxiety that had begun to consume her. Elena convinced herself that she had a responsibility, a duty, to prevent what she believed was a dangerous path. She believed the world outside could not protect Liam, and if she did not intervene, no one else would. Liam, meanwhile, felt increasingly suffocated. He had hoped that the truth would bring freedom, but instead it seemed to tighten a noose around him. He became quieter, avoiding eye contact, and spent hours locked in his room, scrolling through forums and social media, seeking validation he could not find at home. Each time Elena passed by his door, he felt her gaze, heavy and judgmental, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Even simple activities, like eating at the table or doing laundry, felt like navigating a minefield, where a single misstep could trigger anger or disappointment. Elena's obsession deepened as she sought guidance in unusual places. She discovered online forums and articles discussing how to correct or guide transgender family members. Misinterpreting them as advice, she began to plan ways to assert control over Liam, convinced that she alone could save him from what she saw as a life of confusion and shame. She started restricting access to certain books, monitoring his internet activity, and questioning him endlessly about his friends and online communities. Every action was justified in her mind. Every restriction, every intrusion was an act of protection. Neighbors and friends began to notice a subtle change in Elena's demeanor. She appeared more intense, more rigid, and more consumed by matters that had once seemed trivial. She no longer attended social events as casually, and her polite smiles became tighter, more forced. Some noticed Liam's growing withdrawal, but few could understand the tensions simmering inside the house. He seemed polite, as always, but the light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by caution and fear. The house itself seemed to reflect the growing tension. Rooms once filled with warmth felt colder, the air heavier. Small arguments escalated into silent standoffs, each trying to navigate a world that felt increasingly hostile. Elena's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: love, fear, anger, and an obsessive desire to control. She believed she was doing the right thing, while Liam's every instinct screamed danger. The conflict between them was quiet but intense, a battle of wills that neither could win. As days turned into weeks, the obsession took a darker turn. Elena began imagining scenarios in which she intervened more forcefully. The thoughts that once were fleeting now lingered, growing bolder and more elaborate. Liam sensed the shift, but could not yet grasp the full extent of what Elena was planning. A silent tension hung over the household, growing thicker with each passing day, and a sense of impending tragedy quietly settled in, unseen by anyone outside the house. The stage was being set, and the peaceful facade of their town hid the storm that was quietly gathering inside one unassuming home. As the weeks passed, the quiet tension in Elena's house grew heavier, like a storm cloud pressing down on every corner. The neighbors began noticing small, subtle changes. Liam no longer lingered outside to chat with friends or walk to the corner store. He appeared smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, eyes constantly scanning for signs of Elena's scrutiny. Once bright and talkative, he had become withdrawn, retreating into books, music, and the small corners of his room where Elena's watchful eyes could not reach. The town's residents assumed he was merely shy or stressed from school, never suspecting the deeper currents at play. Elena, meanwhile, had become increasingly consumed by her obsession. She watched Liam move through the house as if she were following his every step. She questioned him about where he had been, who he had seen, and why he spent so much time alone. Every answer he gave felt to her like a challenge or a lie, feeding her paranoia. Simple actions, like Liam choosing a different route to school or wearing a shirt she had never seen before, were interpreted as acts of rebellion. Elena's thoughts began to spiral, and she started imagining what the world outside would do to him, how it might mislead him, and what could happen if she failed to intervene. She began to take notes, jotting down observations about Liam's behavior, the people he interacted with, and his interests. She researched relentlessly, reading stories and posts online about families saving children who identified as transgender. Every article she read reinforced her belief that drastic action was necessary. She did not see these steps as harmful, but as preparation, a plan to protect her grandson from a life she could not allow. Her mind worked in loops of justification, fear, and obsession, each thought feeding the next, until her focus narrowed entirely on controlling him. Liam sensed the mounting danger, though he could not articulate it fully. The atmosphere at home became increasingly oppressive. Even the simplest tasks, like doing homework or making a snack, were fraught with tension. Elena's presence felt constant, her gaze inescapable. He started avoiding interactions, spending longer periods outside, walking the streets aimlessly to escape the suffocating watchfulness. Despite these efforts, Elena's influence reached him even there. She would question him about where he had gone or what he had done the moment he returned. Each confrontation left him more anxious, more fearful, and more isolated. Outside the house, life continued as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing behind closed doors. Friends, teachers, and neighbors saw only the polite young man who smiled quietly and the devoted grandmother who appeared caring and concerned. No one suspected the obsessive intensity that had begun to dominate Elena's thoughts, nor the fear that had begun to shadow Liam's every move. The warnings were subtle but clear, small signs of distress, minor acts of rebellion, quiet moments of withdrawal, all pointing to a household on the brink. Elena's obsession had transformed into a dangerous, unyielding force, and Liam's isolation had become absolute. The tension was no longer hidden beneath polite smiles and polite conversations. It filled every corner of the house, suffusing the air, touching every interaction, and building toward an inevitable confrontation. The pieces were in place for a tragedy that neither the town nor the family could yet imagine, a storm that was coming faster than anyone could see. The night of the tragedy began like any other, with the house cloaked in silence and the wind whispering through the trees outside. The storm clouds hung low, pressing a heavy darkness over the town of Millbrook, and inside Elena's home, tension had reached an unbearable peak. Liam sat in his room, trying to distract himself with music and books, but every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of the curtains, Elena's quiet footsteps, felt amplified, like warnings he could not escape. He sensed something in the air, a shift in Elena that made the walls feel tighter, the shadows darker. Fear had replaced the nervous tension he had carried for weeks, settling into every nerve. Elena moved through the house with a quiet intensity, her mind racing with thoughts she could not stop. She had convinced herself that drastic action was necessary, that if she failed, the family, the town, and even Liam himself would face consequences she could not allow. Her planning, which had begun as obsessive monitoring and questioning, had escalated to a dangerous point. Each step in her mind felt justified, every thought a moral imperative, even as a small part of her struggled to reconcile love for her grandson with the overwhelming need to correct him. The confrontation began suddenly. Elena entered Liam's room, her presence like a shadow filling every corner. He looked up, sensing immediately that something had shifted beyond her usual intensity. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a rigid, unyielding conviction that terrified him. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside, lightning flashing intermittently through the window, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The quiet house had become a trap, a space where fear and obsession collided. In the tense silence, Elena's emotions boiled over. She acted decisively, convinced that she was performing a necessary act of protection. The confrontation escalated, the details of which would later horrify the town. Her reasoning had narrowed so completely that she no longer saw Liam as her grandson, but as a problem to be solved. Her movements were deliberate, cold, and terrifyingly certain. Liam, in those final moments, could only feel the full weight of the danger he had feared, realizing too late that the safety of home had vanished entirely. Outside, the storm raged, masking sounds of the struggle within. The neighbors, unaware of the tragedy unfolding, continued their evening routines, oblivious to the horror hidden behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary house. When the confrontation ended, the house returned to its eerie quiet, the air thick with the finality of what had occurred. Elena stood alone, her thoughts racing, convinced that she had acted out of necessity even as the reality of her actions began to sink in. The next morning, the town would awaken to a shocking revelation. The home that had seemed ordinary, calm, and safe was now the scene of a terrible crime. The story of Elena and Liam would spread quickly, leaving neighbors and authorities alike grappling with the unimaginable. A grandmother, revered and respected, had taken the life of her own grandson. The quiet streets of Millbrook would never feel the same again, and the tragedy would mark the beginning of a long, painful reckoning for the family, the community, and the nation. The morning after the storm, Millbrook awoke to a sense of unease that no one could explain. The quiet streets, usually filled with children walking to school and neighbors chatting over fences, felt heavier, as if the town itself sensed the tragedy that had unfolded. Inside Elena's house, the aftermath of the night's events hung like a thick fog. Rooms were eerily silent, the air stale, and the faint scent of fear lingered. Neighbors who had come to check on the family noticed the unusual quiet and called the authorities, unaware of the horror waiting behind the closed doors. Police arrived quickly, sirens cutting through the morning stillness. Officers moved cautiously through the house, noting that there were no signs of forced entry. Everything appeared undisturbed at first glance, but a deeper look revealed the unimaginable. Liam had been killed, and the scene suggested that the person responsible was someone familiar, someone with intimate knowledge of the household. The shock of realizing this crime had happened within what should have been a safe home rippled through the investigators. Elena was found sitting calmly in the living room, as if waiting for them. When questioned, she admitted to what she had done, but her explanation was chilling in its clarity. She described her actions not as a crime, but as a moral duty, a way to protect her grandson and, in her mind, preserve the family. Her words were precise, her tone measured, yet the absence of remorse made the room feel colder. Investigators were forced to confront the terrifying reality that Elena had acted with deliberate intent, guided by obsession and rigid belief rather than impulse. As news of the crime spread, Millbrook was gripped by disbelief. Friends, neighbors, and local media struggled to reconcile the image of the kindly grandmother with the reality of the murder. People speculated about what could have driven someone so respected to commit such a horrific act. Authorities began piecing together Elena's recent behavior, her increasing obsession with Liam's identity, and the online activity that suggested a long period of planning. Each detail painted a picture of a mind consumed by fear and control, yet it was almost impossible to fathom the depths to which she had gone. Experts in psychology and criminal behavior were consulted, offering insight into Elena's actions. They spoke of obsessive tendencies, rigid thinking, and how extreme beliefs can sometimes lead otherwise ordinary people to commit unimaginable acts. The community learned that the danger had been building quietly, that Liam's isolation and Elena's obsession were warning signs that had gone unnoticed until it was far too late. The story became not just a crime investigation, but a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked fear, intolerance, and the lack of support for vulnerable individuals. Memories of Liam flooded the town, his shy smiles, quiet humor, and the way he had always been kind to others. The contrast between the young man everyone remembered and the tragedy that had occurred created a collective grief that was almost tangible. For Millbrook, the crime was more than a shocking headline. It was a wound that would take years to heal, a reminder that even in peaceful towns, danger can lurk in the most familiar places, hidden behind ordinary faces and ordinary routines. The trial of Eleanor Hayes gripped the town of Millbrook and soon drew attention from the entire nation. Courtroom seats were filled with a mix of neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers, all trying to make sense of the crime that had shattered their sense of safety. The public entered the courthouse with heavy hearts, knowing they were about to witness the unraveling of a life they had believed to be ordinary and respectable. The trial opened with a stark recounting of the events, the prosecution laying out the meticulous planning and chilling obsession that had driven Eleanor to kill her own grandson. Evidence revealed Eleanor's growing fixation, the hours spent monitoring Liam, the notes she had taken, and the online searches that detailed ways to correct him. Each piece painted a picture of a woman convinced she was acting in the name of morality, but blind to the humanity of her grandson. Witnesses testified about Liam's quiet nature, his attempts to live authentically, and the isolation he endured within the very home that should have been his sanctuary. The contrast between Eleanor's justification and the stark reality of Liam's fear and suffering left the courtroom in stunned silence. The defense attempted to frame Eleanor as misguided rather than malicious, emphasizing her strict upbringing, traditional beliefs, and the stress of watching her grandson struggle. They argued she had acted out of love, not cruelty, and that she was a product of her environment. Experts on mental health testified on her obsessive tendencies and rigid thinking, explaining how extreme fear and inflexible beliefs can cloud judgment. Yet the evidence of premeditation, of careful planning, and the cold precision of her actions weighed heavily against these arguments, leaving jurors and the public with an uneasy mix of horror and fascination. Outside the courtroom, the community grappled with a mixture of grief, anger, and disbelief. Memorials for Liam began to appear, filled with flowers, notes, and photographs that captured the warmth and gentleness he had shown in life. Friends spoke openly about his kindness, creativity, and the courage it took for him to embrace his identity, even in the face of fear. The tragedy ignited national discussions about the risks faced by transgender youth, the importance of family support, and the dangers of extreme beliefs when left unchecked. Many questioned how a grandmother, someone they had trusted and respected, could commit such an act, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, fear, and obsession. The courtroom proceedings exposed a deeper, more painful conflict, a clash between generational values and the evolving understanding of identity and acceptance. Eleanor's actions became a symbol of the consequences when rigid belief systems collide with the need for self-expression and autonomy. The trial did not just determine guilt, it forced the nation to reflect on the societal pressures that can push ordinary people toward extraordinary acts of harm. When the verdict was finally read, Eleanor was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The community was left to reckon with the aftermath, the loss of Liam, the shattering of trust, and the reminder that danger can sometimes exist within the most familiar and seemingly safe places. The trial became a lasting chapter in Millbrook's history, a painful but necessary examination of morality, obsession, and the cost of intolerance. The death of Liam Carter left a wound in Millbrook that would never fully heal. The small town, once defined by quiet streets and polite neighbors, now carried the memory of a tragedy that had occurred behind closed doors. Families whispered to each other about what had happened, and parents worried about the pressures and dangers that young people could face in silence. Liam's absence was felt everywhere: the empty seat at the local cafe, the vacant corner of the park where he used to sit, the quietness of a home that had once been filled with tentative hope and hidden dreams. His life, short and stolen, became a symbol of the vulnerabilities of youth and the consequences of intolerance. Memorials sprang up in Liam's honor. Friends, classmates, and strangers left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, recounting memories of his kindness, his creativity, and the courage it had taken to live authentically. Some shared stories of his quiet resilience, the way he had smiled despite the fear he felt, and the small ways he had touched lives without seeking attention. These memorials became not just tributes to a young life lost, but also a rallying point for awareness about the struggles of transgender youth, the importance of family acceptance, and the dangers of unchecked obsession and rigid thinking. Eleanor Hayes was now serving a life sentence without parole. Behind the walls of the prison, she had time to reflect, or at least to sit with the reality of what she had done. Reports indicated that she continued to insist she had acted out of love, convinced in her own mind that she had performed a moral duty. Outside, however, the world saw her differently, not as a caring grandmother, but as a woman whose fear, prejudice, and obsession had led to the ultimate betrayal. Her life became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the destructive power of unchecked beliefs when combined with isolation and obsession. The community of Millbrook struggled to move forward. Families became more aware of the pressures young people faced, especially those who did not fit traditional molds. Schools and local organizations began hosting discussions about inclusion, mental health, and the importance of supporting children in expressing their true selves. Liam's death, though tragic, sparked conversations that might save lives in the future, highlighting the need for vigilance, empathy, and understanding in even the most familiar places. Over time, Liam's story spread beyond Millbrook. Articles, documentaries, and social media posts chronicled his life and the circumstances of his death. People across the country debated, reflected, and mourned. The tragedy became a reminder that identity, acceptance, and love cannot be dictated by fear or rigid traditions. Liam's memory endured, not just as a victim, but as a young person who had the courage to be himself, even in the face of unimaginable danger. Though Eleanor's actions had ended his life, they could not erase the impact he had made. His story became a lasting legacy, a warning, and a call for compassion. In the hearts of those who knew him, and in the broader community he had never fully touched in life, Liam's presence continued to inspire change, hope, and a commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Millbrook would never forget, and neither would the world. If you want, I can compile all 8 chapters into a single, cohesive narrative, polished and formatted like a ready-to-use YouTube documentary script, including packing, suspense cues, and narration flow to keep viewers engaged from start to finish.